The landlord who threw my dying grandma out in the rain? I waited 5 years, bought his building, and used a forgotten clause in her old lease to make his entire family homeless. Apartment 4B wasn't just a place. It was a feeling. It was the warm, comforting smell of cinnamon and yeast that hit you the moment you stepped onto the 4th floor, the scent of my grandmother Elena's baking that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. It was the deep, worn-out groove in her favorite armchair, the one where she'd sat for 40 years telling me stories about our family, her voice a soft, steady anchor in my life. It was the series of faint pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, a faded ladder charting my growth from a clumsy little boy into a man. For 4 decades, that apartment wasn't just her home. It was the heart of our entire family, the one constant in a changing world. My grandma was the unofficial matriarch of the whole building. She knew everyone's name, every birthday, every heartbreak. The other long-term tenants, most of them seniors on fixed incomes, were more than neighbors. They were a sprawling, eclectic family. For years, the building had been owned by old Mr. Henderson, a kind man who knew that a leaky faucet was more important than a late rent check. But Mr. Henderson passed away, and his son, who had no sentimental attachment to a building full of old people, sold it to a faceless real estate corporation. Their name was Apex Urban Ventures, which sounded exactly as soulless as it was. And their man on the ground was a guy named Sterling. He showed up one Tuesday, not to introduce himself, but to inspect his new underperforming asset. That's what he called it. An asset, not a home. He looked like he'd been assembled in a boardroom, impeccably tailored suit, shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the coldest, most indifferent eyes I had ever seen. I was there helping my grandmother with her groceries, and I saw him in the hallway, running a finger along the wall and then looking at the dust on his fingertip with disgust. I introduced myself, trying to be neighborly. "Hi, I'm Alex. My grandmother Elena lives here in 4B. He shook my hand, his grip firm but completely lifeless, like shaking hands with a mannequin. His eyes weren't on me. They were scanning the old light fixtures, the worn-out runner in the hall, the slight scuffs on the baseboards. He looked right past my grandmother, who was standing beside me with a polite smile, as if she were just another piece of outdated furniture that needed to be replaced before he could raise the rent. He gave a curt nod, said nothing, and continued his inspection, making notes on a tablet. I remember turning to my grandmother and saying, "Well, he seems efficient." But she just looked at me. Her warm, wise eyes suddenly clouded with a worry I hadn't seen before. At the time, I just thought he was a typical, heartless landlord. I had no idea that his arrival was the first of 2 ticking clocks that were about to start counting down the final months of my grandmother's life. The first clock started ticking on a cold Thursday in October. We were in a doctor's office that smelled of antiseptic and bad news. I sat beside my grandmother, holding her hand, its skin as soft and thin as old paper. The doctor, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, spoke in a low, somber tone. It was pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Inoperable. He gave her 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months. The words echoed in the small, sterile room, a death sentence delivered with professional sympathy. I felt the world tilt on its axis. But my grandmother, my strong, resilient Elena, just squeezed my hand. Later that night, sitting in her worn-out armchair, she looked at me, her eyes clear and steady. "I don't want to go to a hospital, Alex," she said, her voice firm. "I don't want to die in a stranger's room. I want to be here. In my home." It was her one and only request, her final wish, and I promised her I would make it happen. The second clock started ticking 3 days later. It arrived in a slick, glossy envelope with the Apex Urban Ventures logo embossed in the corner. It was a formal letter, addressed to all the long-term, rent-controlled tenants. The letter was filled with cheerful corporate jargon about revitalizing the community and unlocking the property's potential. Then it got to the point. They were offering a one-time cash-for-keys buyout, $5,000. In a neighborhood where a one-bedroom apartment now rented for $3,000 a month, it was more than an insult. It was a joke. It was a thinly veiled threat, a way to get the old tenants out without the messy legalities of a formal eviction. My grandmother, ever the lady, simply wrote a polite, one-sentence letter back, declining their generous offer. But I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. I found Sterling's direct number and I called him. I tried to be calm, to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might be buried under that expensive suit. I explained the situation. I told him my grandmother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I told him she had less than a year to live. I told him her only wish was to die peacefully in the home she'd lived in for 40 years. I practically begged him. Please, I said, my voice cracking. Just a few more months. That's all we're asking. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A perfect, calculated silence. Then his voice came back, as smooth and cold as polished marble. Mr. Garcia, he said, I do understand your grandmother's sentimental attachment to the unit. I truly do. But sentimental value doesn't pay the mortgage. The offer is final. And then he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, and I realized he wasn't just a landlord. He was a predator. He could smell the weakness, the vulnerability, and he knew he had us trapped. He knew she was too sick to fight back, and he was about to start a war he was absolutely certain he would win. Sterling knew he couldn't legally evict a dying old woman without cause. So, he decided to make her life a living hell until she had no choice but to leave on her own. It was a war of 1,000 tiny, deliberate cuts. It started in November, just as the first real cold snap of the year hit. I arrived at my grandmother's apartment to find her huddled in her armchair, wrapped in 3 blankets, her breath misting in the air. The heat was out, just in her unit. I called the emergency maintenance line and was met with a cheerful, unhelpful automated message. It took 3 days and a dozen increasingly frantic calls from me before a surly repairman finally showed up, muttering something about a faulty valve. The heat came back on, but I knew with a sick certainty that this was no accident. A week later, the cosmetic renovations began. Sterling had hired a crew to work on the apartment directly above my grandmother's. The work started at 7 a.m. sharp every single morning, including Saturdays. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical assault. The sound of power saws and industrial sanders, the percussive, bone-jarring thud of hammers, it was relentless. My grandmother, already weakened by her illness, would just sit in her chair, her hands pressed to her temples, a pained expression on her face. I called Sterling to complain, to ask if they could at least start at a more reasonable hour. Ah, yes, he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, but our contractors are on a very tight schedule. We're trying to improve the building for everyone. I knew he was lying. I knew the noise was the point. The final petty act of cruelty came a month before Christmas. My grandmother had spent 30 years tending to a small patch of rose bushes in the building's shared courtyard. They were her pride and joy, a splash of vibrant color in a world of concrete and brick. I arrived one afternoon to find 2 men with shovels, ripping them out of the ground. They were tossing the thorny bushes into a dumpster like they were trash. I ran over to them, demanding to know what they were doing. They just shrugged and pointed to a work order. I called Sterling, my voice shaking with rage. What are you doing? Those were my grandmother's roses. There was a pause, and then he said, We're upgrading the courtyard, installing a more modern, low-maintenance gravel feature. It will improve the property value. I looked at my grandmother, who was watching from her window, her hand pressed against the glass, her face a mask of quiet devastation. Each of these incidents on its own was a minor inconvenience, but together, they were a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. I could see the toll it was taking on her. The light in her eyes was dimming, her energy was fading, and my own helplessness, my inability to protect her from this slow, cruel assault. It was curdling into a dark, simmering rage that felt like poison in my veins. But I still thought that as long as we had the lease, as long as the law was on our side, he couldn't actually force her out. I was so naive. The harassment wasn't working fast enough for Sterling, so he escalated. I arrived at the apartment one evening to find a thick white envelope taped to my grandmother's front door. It wasn't a letter. It was a formal eviction notice. My blood ran cold as I tore it open, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. The reason for the eviction was so absurd, so transparently false, I almost laughed. It claimed my grandmother had violated the terms of her lease by housing an unauthorized long-term guest. Me. I had been staying over most nights, sleeping on her lumpy old couch to help with her medication, to make her meals, to just be there. And this monster, This vulture in a $1,000 suit was using my care for my dying grandmother as a weapon to make her homeless. I called legal aid the next morning, my voice shaking with a rage so pure it felt like a physical force. The lawyer on the other end of the line was a tired-sounding but kind woman. She listened to my story, and I could hear her sigh with a weary familiarity. "It's completely baseless," she confirmed after I'd read her the notice. "We can fight this, and we will almost certainly win." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "But I need to be honest with you," she continued, her voice gentle. "He knows you'll win. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to win with the calendar. The court process is slow. It could take 6, maybe even 8 months to get a hearing. He's betting that your grandmother won't have that much time." She was right. He knew my grandmother was too sick and that we were too financially drained to mount a sustained legal battle. He was just running out the clock. I tried calling Sterling again and again. I left furious, pleading voicemails. I sent emails with urgent in the subject line. He ignored them all, letting the legal machinery of the eviction process grind forward on its own, slow and unstoppable. That's when I saw the real change in my grandmother. It wasn't just fatigue anymore. It was despair. The fight went out of her. She stopped eating. I'd make her favorite soup, and she'd just stare at it, her spoon resting in her hand. One evening, she was sitting in her armchair, looking at the old framed photos on the mantelpiece. "You know, Alex," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "It's not just the apartment. It's the memories. Every corner of this place has a memory attached to it. The spot where your grandfather proposed. The window where I watched you play in the street. He's taking my memories from me before I'm even gone." I watched my strong, beautiful grandmother just give up. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that Sterling was about to get exactly what he wanted. He was going to put her out on the street, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The day of the eviction, the sky was a bruised, angry gray. We were still packing the last of the boxes when the movers arrived, 2 big, burly men with sullen expressions. And right behind them, holding a clipboard and wearing an impeccably tailored raincoat, was Sterling. He was there to personally oversee the removal of his underperforming asset. I met him in the hallway, my hands trembling as I held out a folded piece of paper. It was the official intake form from the hospice service, the one that proved my grandmother was actively in end-of-life care. "Please," I begged, my voice hoarse, "just look at this. We're not asking for months, just a few more weeks. Please, don't do this to her." He didn't even glance at the paper. He just looked past me into the apartment, a flicker of impatience in his cold eyes. He adjusted the knot on his tie. "Look," he said, his voice a low, condescending purr. "I'm a businessman. And as a businessman, I can tell you that the most compassionate thing I can do right now is make this quick." And then, as if on cue, the sky opened up. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a sudden torrential downpour, the kind of hard driving rain that soaks you to the bone in seconds. The movers didn't stop. On Sterling's curt nod, they began carrying my grandmother's life out into the storm. I watched in horror as they tossed cardboard boxes onto the wet curb, the rain immediately soaking through to the precious memories inside. One of the boxes, marked Christmas ornaments in my grandmother's spidery handwriting, slipped from a mover's grasp. It hit the pavement with a sickening, crystalline crunch, the sound of 100 delicate antique glass ornaments shattering into 1,000 pieces. I had already helped my grandmother down to my car, shielding her from the worst of the rain with my own jacket. She was sitting in the passenger seat, silent, her face turned towards the window. I stood on the sidewalk, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, and I watched, helpless, as a lifetime of memories was reduced to a pile of soggy, ruined trash. And then I saw it. A small wooden picture frame, washed out of a broken box by the deluge, floating face down in a growing puddle on the street. It was the photo of my late grandfather that had always sat on her nightstand. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching it slowly sink into the grimy water as my grandmother, my strong, proud grandmother, finally broke, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. In that moment, watching the rain wash away everything she had ever held dear, the grief in my heart began to crystallize into something else. Something harder, something colder, something that would wait. Because I knew, as I finally got into my car and drove her away from the only home she had ever known, that this was not the end. It was just the beginning. We brought her home to my apartment, to the small, sterile guest room that smelled of fresh paint and nothing else. It wasn't home. It wasn't apartment 4B. And the change, it broke something in her that the cancer couldn't touch. Her decline, which had been a slow, sad slope, became a freefall. The hospice nurse told me, in a quiet, sympathetic voice, that the extreme stress of the eviction had likely accelerated things, stealing weeks, maybe even a month, of the precious little time she had left. She faded quickly after that, drifting in and out of consciousness. But one afternoon, just 3 weeks after Sterling had thrown her out, her eyes fluttered open. They were clear, lucid, for the first time in days. She looked at me, really looked at me, and squeezed my hand with a surprising strength. "Alex," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Listen to me." I leaned in close, my ear next to her lips. "Don't let what he did make your heart ugly, my boy," she said, each word an effort. "But you make sure he understands. You make sure he understands what he took from us." Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. A few hours later, I was sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of her chest, when it just stopped. She was gone. And as I sat there in the profound, crushing silence of that room, the grief that washed over me was intertwined with something else. An ice-cold, diamond-hard fury. It was a promise. It was a vow. The funeral was small, just a few of her old neighbors from the building and me. I stood at her graveside, the cold winter wind whipping at my black suit, and I made a silent promise to the freshly turned earth. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I would not let her final wish go unanswered. I would make Sterling understand, and in doing so, I would find a way to get justice for the woman who had been the heart of my entire life. I just had to find the right weapon, and as it turned out, my grandmother had left one for me, hidden away in a box of water-damaged papers. Cleaning out my grandmother's storage unit was a special kind of hell. Every box I opened was a fresh wave of grief. But in a small metal lockbox tucked away beneath a stack of old photo albums, I found 2 envelopes. The first contained a life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount, $50,000, but it was everything she had managed to save. It was her final gift to me, the seed money for a future she wouldn't get to see. And in the second envelope, I found the weapon. It was her original lease for apartment 4B, signed in 1978. The paper was yellowed and brittle, stained with 40 years of coffee rings and life. Most of it was standard boilerplate text, but as I was about to fold it up, a single, strangely worded paragraph caught my eye. It was clearly written on a typewriter, probably by old Mr. Henderson himself, long before corporate lawyers got involved. The clause was poorly drafted, almost nonsensical, but its intent was clear. It granted the original tenant, or their direct heir, the right of first offer on the entire property should it ever be put up for sale. My heart started to pound. I didn't even know if that was a real legal thing, but the words were right there, in black and white. The next day, I found myself in the dusty, cluttered office of a cynical, old-school real estate lawyer named Saul. He had whiskey on his breath and a tie that was older than I was. I slid the ancient lease across his desk. He picked it up, squinted at it through his thick glasses, and then he did something that made my blood run cold. He laughed, a deep, booming laugh that shook his whole body. "Kid, where in God's name did you find this?" he chuckled, tapping the page with a thick finger. "This is a fascinating piece of ancient history. A right of first offer clause on a rent-controlled unit. I haven't seen one of these in 30 years. So, it's real?" I asked, my voice tight. "Oh, it's real, all right," he said, leaning back in his creaky chair. Is it enforceable? Probably not. The new owners would argue it's an anachronistic, unconscionable term. They'd tie you up in court for years until you ran out of money. It's a legal dead end. I felt the hope in my chest deflate. But as I sat there listening to him explain all the ways it would fail, a new idea began to form in my mind. He was right. The clause itself was weak. It wasn't the weapon, but it had just given me a target. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was a logistician. I spent my days planning, strategizing, looking for weaknesses in a system, and I had just found one. The clause itself didn't matter. What mattered was the idea it had just planted in my head. I was going to buy the building. I was going to own it. And I was going to use Sterling's own cold, heartless logic against him. The plan was born in that dusty office, a tiny, flickering flame of vengeance that I was about to spend the next 5 years of my life nurturing into an inferno. The 5 years that followed were a blur of spreadsheets and sacrifice. My grief, my rage, I channeled all of it into a single monastic purpose. My life became a simple, brutal equation. Every waking hour was dedicated to acquiring 2 things: capital and knowledge. My day job in logistics became a training ground in efficiency and planning, and every Friday at 5 o'clock, when my colleagues were heading out for happy hour, I was heading to my second job, waiting tables at a high-end steakhouse downtown. The work was grueling, my feet ached, but the tips were good. And every single dollar, every penny I didn't spend on rent or instant noodles went straight into an investment account. My grandmother's $50,000 became my seed capital, and I nurtured it with a relentless, obsessive focus. But the money was only half the battle. I became a ghost, haunting the world of commercial real estate. My nights were spent not with friends, but with financial reports and zoning regulations. I devoured books on property acquisition. I listened to podcasts about market trends. I learned the language of Sterling's world: cap rates, amortization, leveraged buyouts. I tracked every single one of his company's deals, building a dossier on his business practices, his investment patterns, his weaknesses. I learned that he was aggressive, arrogant, and that he had a fatal flaw. He was blinded by greed. To keep my plan hidden, I needed a shield. I spent $1,000 I couldn't afford to form a limited liability company, a shell corporation that would allow me to operate in anonymity. I spent a long time thinking about the name. It needed to be innocuous, forgettable. I finally settled on one that felt right. E.g. Legacy Properties, for Elena Garcia. It was a private tribute, a secret dedication hidden in plain sight. And all the while, I watched Sterling. I watched as the real estate market boomed and his greed grew with it. I watched him take out massive, risky loans to acquire more and more properties, leveraging himself to the absolute hilt. He was building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a logistician, that it was only a matter of time before the wind changed. I just had to be patient. I had to be ready. I watched, I worked, and I waited for the first sign of a storm on the horizon, the one that would finally make his entire empire vulnerable. And then, one Tuesday morning, the stock market took a nosedive, and I knew the trap was about to be sprung. The economic downturn wasn't a crash, not at first. It was a slow, creeping rot. But for someone like Sterling, who was leveraged to the breaking point, it was a death sentence. I watched his company's stock ticker online every day and saw it bleed value, bit by agonizing bit. He had to liquidate assets, and he had to do it fast. And then, one rainy Tuesday evening, 5 years and 3 months after he'd thrown my grandmother out into a storm, I saw it. I was on my way home from my logistics job, and as I drove past her old building, a jolt went through my entire body. There, staked into the small patch of grass where her rose bushes used to be, was a bright red "for sale" sign. My moment had finally come. I didn't go home. I drove straight to my lawyer's office. Saul was older now, even more cynical, but his eyes lit up when I laid out my plan. He helped me draft the offer that night. It was a masterpiece of strategic cruelty. My anonymous LLC, E.G. Legacy Properties, offered to buy the building with an all-cash offer, no inspections, no contingencies. The price was just under his asking price, low enough to be a bargain, but high enough that in his desperation he wouldn't hesitate. And we promised a 30-day closing. For a man drowning in debt, it was a lifeline. It was an irresistible offer. He took it. Of course he took it. He signed the papers the next day. The 30 days that followed were the most nerve-wracking of my life. I communicated with Sterling's company only through Saul, a ghost in my own transaction. Every email from their lawyers, every request for paperwork was filtered through him. Sterling had no idea who was on the other end of the deal. He just saw a faceless LLC with a mountain of cash, a silent savior who was about to rescue him from his own greed. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Then, on a Friday afternoon, the final email arrived. I was at my desk at work, my heart hammering in my chest with every new message that popped up in my inbox. And then, there it was. The subject line was simple. "It's done." I clicked it open. The body of the email was just 2 sentences. "The wire transfer has been confirmed. Congratulations, Alex. You are now the owner." I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just calmly printed the email, folded it neatly, and put it in my jacket pocket. That evening, I went to my apartment and walked into the living room. My grandmother's old armchair still sat in the corner. I hadn't had the heart to get rid of it. I took the printed email out of my pocket, and I placed it gently on the worn, empty seat. Now all that was left was to meet my new tenant. I waited a week. I let him think he was safe. I let him believe some faceless corporation had bought him out, that he'd gotten away with it. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, I went back to the building. My building. I didn't go to apartment 4B. I took the elevator all the way to the top floor, to the penthouse he had built for himself after pushing out the last of the old tenants. I was holding a single thick envelope. I knocked on the door. I could hear muffled voices inside, a woman laughing. A moment later, the door swung open. It was Sterling. He was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of scotch. He looked annoyed at the interruption, his eyes flicking over me with dismissive impatience. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone bored, and then I watched his face. It was a slow, beautiful, horrifying spectacle. I saw the flicker of annoyance, shift to confusion. And then, as his brain finally caught up, it curdled into a wave of pure, dawning horror as he recognized me. The man whose dying grandmother he had thrown out in the rain, now standing on his doorstep. I didn't say a word. I just held out the envelope. He took it, his hand trembling slightly, and ripped it open. I watched his eyes scan the legal text, his face going from pale to a blotchy, furious red. "What? What is this?" he stammered, the words catching in his throat. I finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, and completely devoid of the emotion that had fueled me for 5 years. "It's a standard owner-occupancy eviction," I said. "Perfectly legal. Your lease is being terminated. You and your family have 60 days to vacate the premises." He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You can't," he finally managed to say. "You can't do this to my family." "My kids, my wife, they live here." I let the moment hang in the air, a perfect, exquisite silence. And then I delivered the killing blow. I leaned in, my voice a soft, venomous whisper, and I gave him his own words back to him, the words that had haunted my nightmares for 5 long years. "I can," I said. "This is a business, not a charity. You should have thought of that before you threw my grandmother out in the rain." I saw the fight, the arrogance, the pure, entitled rage just die in his eyes. He knew he was beaten. He knew he had lost. From behind him, I heard his wife start to cry, a thin, panicked wail. I didn't wait to hear any more. I just turned, my back straight, and walked away, leaving him standing in his doorway with the ruins of his life in his hands. As the elevator doors closed, I knew he would try to fight. But I also knew his life as he knew it was already over. Sterling, of course, tried to fight. Men like him always do. They can't comprehend a world where they don't hold all the cards. My lawyer Saul called me a few days later, a rare chuckle in his voice. "He sicked his high-priced corporate bulldog on me," Saul said. "Spent a full hour yelling about malicious intent and tortious interference. I just faxed him a copy of your grandmother's old lease and a single-page summary of owner-occupancy law." He called back 20 minutes later. Said his client would be complying with the 60-day notice. The eviction was ironclad. Sterling knew it, and fighting it would just burn through the last of his rapidly dwindling cash. The unraveling was quick after that. Word travels fast in a small building. I got a call from Mrs. Diaz in 3B, a woman who had been my grandmother's best friend for 30 years. "Alex," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, joyous disbelief, "is it true? Did you really?" I told her it was. She was silent for a moment, and then I heard her say to her husband in the background, "He did it, Carlos. The boy did it." A few days later, I heard from another tenant that Sterling's wife had packed up her car and the kids and had gone to stay with her sister across town. The underperforming asset was apparently not a good place to raise a family anymore. But the most telling part of his downfall came through my phone. My voicemail, which had been silent for 5 years, suddenly filled up with messages from a number I knew all too well. The first few messages were pure impotent rage. Threats of lawsuits, accusations, promises that he would ruin me. I saved them all. Then the tone began to shift. The rage softened into a desperate, wheedling negotiation. He offered me money, a ludicrous amount, to call off the eviction. He talked about his reputation, about his business contacts. I didn't respond. The final voicemails, they were pathetic. It was just him, his voice thick with what sounded like scotch, just begging. "Please," he slurred in the last message he ever left me. "Please, don't do this." "I'll do anything. You're destroying my life." I deleted that one. I didn't want his pity. I just wanted him gone. The other tenants, the ones who had loved my grandmother, they watched it all unfold with a quiet, stoic satisfaction. When I showed up on a Saturday with a few boxes to start cleaning out the penthouse, 3 of the older gentlemen from the second floor were waiting for me in the lobby. "We heard you might need a hand, son," one of them said, tipping his hat. They weren't just offering to help me move in. They were welcoming a neighbor home. And as the end of the 60-day notice approached, I knew there was one final scene left to play out in this long, painful drama. On the final day, the day the movers came for Sterling, the weather was perfect. It was a beautiful, crisp April morning, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue, a perfect, cruel inversion of the torrential gray day they had thrown my grandmother out. I didn't go into the building. I just parked my car across the street in the exact same spot where I had sat with her, watching her life get ruined. And I watched. The movers were a different crew this time, but their indifference was the same. They moved with a detached efficiency, carrying out pieces of a life that wasn't theirs. I watched as Sterling's ridiculously oversized leather sofa was unceremoniously dumped on the curb, right on the exact patch of concrete where my grandmother's box of Christmas ornaments had shattered. I saw them bring out his son's expensive gaming chair, a monstrous thing of black and red plastic, and place it next to a stack of sleek, modern furniture that looked completely out of place on the dirty sidewalk, and then Sterling himself came out. He looked diminished. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and his face was a mask of pure, impotent rage. He started directing the movers, yelling at them, his voice sharp and angry. At one point, he looked up and his eyes scanned the street. And then he saw me. He saw my car, and he saw me sitting in the driver's seat watching, his face contorted into a snarl. He started screaming, his mouth forming words that I couldn't hear through my closed window, but that I could read on his lips. Curses, threats. He pointed at me, his whole body shaking with a fury he had nowhere to put. And I just watched. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the hot, satisfying burn of revenge I had fantasized about for 5 long years. I just felt quiet, a profound, empty, and peaceful quiet. The rage was gone. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but the burning need for vengeance had been extinguished. It was over. He was still screaming when I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, not even bothering to look back in the rearview mirror. As I drove away, I knew there was one last thing I had to do, one final promise to keep before I could truly close this chapter of my life. I went to the cemetery the next day. The grass over her grave was green and full now, the stone warmed by the morning sun. I brought with me a small potted rose bush, its buds just beginning to open into a deep velvety red. I knelt down and placed it gently in front of her headstone, my fingers brushing against the cool granite of her name. "It's done, Grandma," I said, my voice quiet in the peaceful morning air. It's finally done. I think he understands now. And as I said the words, I realized the strangest thing. The fire in my gut, the cold, hard knot of rage that had been my constant companion for 5 years, it was gone. It had been replaced by a simple, quiet peace. I finally understood what she had meant in those final moments. Don't let what he did make your heart ugly. The revenge was never about my own satisfaction. It wasn't about making him hurt. It was about making him understand. It was for her. I stayed there for a long time, just talking to her, telling her about my plan. Because I wasn't moving into the penthouse, and I wasn't moving into apartment 4B. The day after I closed on the building, I made a call to a local charity, one that helps low-income seniors find affordable housing. I told them I had a rent-controlled, fully furnished one-bedroom apartment, and I wanted to offer it to someone on their waiting list. Someone who, like my grandmother, was at risk of being displaced from the neighborhood they had called home their entire life. A week later, I stood in the hallway outside apartment 4B. The smell of fresh paint had replaced the lingering scent of my grandmother's baking, but the light from the window still hit the floor in the same familiar way. The door opened, and a small, elderly woman with kind eyes and a smile that reminded me so much of Elena looked out at me. Her name was Mrs. Gable. She had lived in the neighborhood for 50 years and had been on the verge of being priced out after her husband passed away. I held out the old brass key to the apartment. "Welcome home, Mrs. Gable," I said. She took the key, her hand trembling slightly, and her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, son," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." And I just smiled. Because I did. I knew exactly what it meant. And so, we leave our narrator not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of profound, quiet peace. This story starts as a classic tale of revenge, a 5-year, perfectly executed plan to deliver justice. But when you really unpack it, you realize it's about so much more than just getting even. It's a story about how deep grief can be forged into an unbreakable sense of purpose, and how the most satisfying acts of vengeance aren't about destruction, but about creation. The landlord, Sterling, only understood the world in terms of property value, profit, and loss. But the narrator's grandmother understood that the true value of a home is measured in memories. It makes you wonder, what is the ultimate victory? Is it simply making your enemy suffer, or is it proving that your own values of kindness, of community, of legacy are stronger than their greed? The narrator didn't just take Sterling's building. He honored his grandmother's memory by refusing to let the injustice make his own heart ugly. If you believe every story is a chance to unpack the complexities of human nature, make sure to subscribe and join the conversation. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories to unpack together. Until then, stay thoughtful.